like to thank, first of all those people who have bought my latest book, They Got Away with Murder, Volume 3. I hope you enjoyed it, or are enjoying it, or if you haven't bought it yet, which I hope you will, that you will enjoy it. And if you did enjoy it, then I'd be especially grateful if you'd leave a comment or approval rating on Amazon. It's always helpful to me. And I'm always delighted to read the comments that people leave there, especially if they're positive ones, of course. Doris Duke was a fabulously wealthy woman, a billionairess, generous to a fault, with the many charities she supported across a wide spectrum of issues, but mean and mean-spirited to anyone who dared to cross her, and occasionally violent. In 1966, she got away with murder.
The 6th of October 1966 was a beautiful autumn day in Newport, Rhode Island. The temperature was in the high teens centigrade in the afternoon, and the leaves fell silently upon the New England sidewalks. It was at about 7 minutes after 5 o'clock when Officer Edward Angel, in his patrol car on Bellevue Avenue, received a radio message that there had been an accident at the gates of Rough Point, the Tudor-style mansion of 54-year-old billionairess socialite Doris Duke. Upon arrival at Rough Point, Angel found a Dodge Polara station wagon crashed into a tree, with a woman sitting in it, extremely upset. He looked underneath the car and saw what appeared to be a man, and said, "He's under the car." The woman wailed and got out of the vehicle and began walking up and down. Just then a nurse, Judith Tom, and her father Louis, sightseers from Milwaukee, were passing by and came to see if they could offer assistance. Judith was a nurse, and Patrolman Angel asked her to look after the woman, whom he now realized was Doris Duke herself. Doris ran up the drive and into the house, saying, "I've run over Ed," while Judith Tom did what she could to calm the woman down. An ambulance arrived soon afterwards, and the man beneath the rear axle of the car, who was, according to the passport found in his pocket, Doris Duke's art collector, Eduardo Tirella, was pronounced dead at the scene. Doris Duke was born in New York City to the tobacco tycoon James Buchanan Duke and his wife Nannaline Holt Inman on the 22nd of November 1912. J.B. Duke was a ruthless businessman and founded the American Tobacco Company in 1890, and by this means controlled 90% of the U.S. tobacco market. Uncompromising in labor disputes and giving no quarter to competitors, his philosophy and character were simple, and are perhaps best summed up by his favorite epithet, "Trust no one." It made him one of the richest men in the United States, and after the birth of his only child, Doris, when he was 56 years old, he seems to have passed this intractable gene and the teaching it engendered onto her. Doris lived on her father's 2,700-acre estate, Duke Farms, in New Jersey as a child, and when her father, J.B., died in 1925, 13-year-old Doris Duke inherited, along with her mother, an estate worth billions of dollars in today's terms. Doris had also inherited her father's ruthless business streak, because she sued her mother in 1927 to prevent the sale of parts of her father's estate. She was then just 14 years old. She was commonly known as the world's richest girl, and she got richer. Her father's will was fashioned in such a manner to bestow upon her further endowments of wealth as she reached each new milestone in age, 21, 25, and 30 years. When her mother died in 1962, she inherited her fortune also, a further $250 million. Doris was rich, super rich, intelligent, tall, and attractive in a rather steely, uncompromising way. She also had a bad temper, which could turn violent on occasions. She was a physically robust woman, and took an interest in many activities. She was a good surfer, an excellent swimmer, took singing lessons, and during the war worked for a time in a canteen for sailors in Egypt, before trying her hand as a journalist in Europe in late 1944. She had numerous homes across the U.S., including Falcon Lair in California, which had once belonged to Rudolph Valentino, an estate in Hawaii called Shangri-La, where she wintered, and the home in New Jersey with its vast tracts of land. Rough Point itself was a mansion with 10 acres amongst the old colonial mansions of Rhode Island, where the richest and most powerful of the American Gilded Age settled themselves along the shoreline. Here the Vanderbilts and Astors established gloating dynasties with their fabulous wealth. Doris Duke married twice, first to James Cromwell in 1935, a political hopeful and sometime U.S. ambassador to Canada. That ended in 1943, and then a second time in 1947 to Porfirio Rubirosa, a Dominican diplomat and playboy. That lasted for just a year. After this she didn't marry again, but had a great many lovers, including the jazz pianist Joe Armand Castro, whom she once stabbed during a row. She met Eduardo Tirella around 1959. He was then a talented 32-year-old interior designer. He had been born in 1924 in Dover, New Jersey, of Italian immigrant parents, was gay, and had ambitions to be a singer. Such ambitions were interrupted by World War II, and in 1943, at the age of 19, he joined the U.S. Army, serving in Europe, where he was awarded the Bronze Star in 1944. After the war he worked as a milliner, a hat designer, and then as an interior designer, doing work for Peggy Lee and Elizabeth Taylor. Doris, who was at this time preoccupied with establishing gardens to honor her father's memory, employed him in the design of her estates and gardens. In the fashion of people in possession of more money than they can possibly spend, Doris nurtured an extensive art collection, beyond anything she could possibly appreciate or enjoy. Recognizing Eduardo's talent and eye for such things, she also employed him as her artistic manager to take charge of her burgeoning art collection. She paid him well, $43,000 per year by the mid-1960s. That's about $400,000 in 2024 terms. And he had living quarters at each of her 5 main estates. She trusted his judgment in all things artistic, it seems, and never bought an artwork of any kind without first consulting him. He became somewhat indispensable to her, and she was emotionally dependent on him as a confidant in her various affairs and fraught relationships, too. She liked to have him on hand at her beck and call at all times. Eduardo became involved with the designer and sculptor Edmund Cara, who moved in the early 1960s from New York to California. Cara was developing a niche in Hollywood and enjoying great success there. Eduardo began to spend more time there and shared a house with him. The two also gave parties attended by Hollywood luminaries. As a result of these associations, Eduardo began to make forays into the movie world himself. He made brief appearances on film and became involved in set design. Doris Duke didn't like the time Eduardo was spending away from her. She was a possessive woman who could countenance no other way than her own. In 1965, Eduardo worked on the movie The Sandpiper with Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, and in 1966 he spent the summer working on a movie for Tony Curtis. Doris Duke was becoming increasingly upset at the prospect of losing Eduardo. It was, in fact, as a result of these forays into set design that he finally decided to quit his job with Doris and take up a new career in set design. He discussed this with his lover, Edmund Cara, who counseled him to be careful in telling Doris of his decision, because he knew enough of their relationship and of Doris's temper to fear she would take his decision poorly. He was right. On the 6th of October 1966, Eduardo flew to Rhode Island with the intention of informing Doris Duke that he was leaving her employment. He planned to collect his belongings from the mansion and then deposit them at the family home in Dover, New Jersey, before heading back to California, permanently. Doris hired a Dodge Polara station wagon and drove to the airport, where she met him and drove him back. At what point Eduardo informed Doris of his plans is not known, but the following afternoon staff overheard a furious row between the two. Soon after this, at about 5 p.m., they left the house together for the last time, and several minutes later Eduardo Tirella was dead, crushed under the rear axle of the Dodge Polara. Doris Duke was taken to Newport Hospital with cuts and abrasions to her face following the crash. Her injuries were, according to the nurse and witness at the scene, minor ones. The state medical examiner, Dr. Philip C. McAllister, arrived at the hospital to examine Tirella's injuries with the purpose of determining the cause of his death. He met Doris Duke, and she promptly hired him as her personal doctor. It was a smart move, although one which should never have been permitted, given his independent role in the matter. In this new role, he promptly placed her in seclusion, declared that she could not be interviewed by police, who were anxious to discover what had happened, and he also gave a statement to the press indicating that he doubted she knew anything about what had happened, stating, furthermore, that it was a freak accident and that she had not been drinking. He also said she had received 30 stitches to her face as a result of the incident. In fact, Doris was not tested for alcohol in her bloodstream, and Judith Tom said Doris had no injuries requiring stitches. A post-mortem conducted by Dr. James J. Flanagan revealed that Tirella had sustained severe injuries to his torso, his spine, and lungs, but had died of massive head injuries which had killed him instantly. His legs were not injured, according to the report, but he had a fractured hip. The difficulties facing authorities in the investigation of Tirella's death were quickly apparent. She was said to be the richest woman in the U.S., She was a friend of the Kennedys. She had many friends in high places, and in Rhode Island she was royalty. It was to be 2 days after the accident when, in her bedroom at Rough Point, in the presence of her attorneys, Doris Duke at last deigned to see officers. 2 detectives, Lieutenant Frank H. Walsh and Detective George Watts, were able to take a statement from her. She sat in bed with her 2 German shepherd dogs, which had previously attacked a number of people walking near her property and had a destruction order in force on them because of this. Doris presumably wanted the detectives to know their place. In her statement, she said she and Tirella were leaving Rough Point, and Tirella was driving the Dodge Polara down the drive. He stopped about 15 feet from the entrance and got out to unlock and remove the chain to open the gates, whereupon she slid over from the passenger seat into the driving seat. As she had hundreds of times before, she said. She released the parking brake, moved the automatic shift lever from park to drive, and accidentally depressed the accelerator pedal rather than the brake, as a result of which the car had moved forward down the drive and pinned Eduardo Tirella against the gates. The Dodge had then crashed through the gates, across the road, through a fence, and into a tree where it stopped. It was, she claimed, her intention to drive through the gates after they were opened and collect Tirella outside in the avenue. Statements were taken from a number of people known to have been at the scene or who arrived within minutes of its occurrence. In particular, Judith Tom, the nurse, who was on the scene directly following Patrolman Edward Angel. But strangely, none of these statements ever saw the light of day. The chief of police, Joseph Radici, informed the press that there were no suspicious circumstances. Tirella and Doris had been going out to dinner together, and Tirella had been crushed against the gates. The matter was an unfortunate accident. His statement was wrong on both counts. They were not going to dinner at all, but to view an antique Doris had had restored at a local shop. The staff had prepared dinner for their return. Nor had Tirella been crushed against the gates, as there was no blood on the gates and no injuries to Tirella's legs. Either Radici was lying, or he was mistaken. The conclusions of the police who examined the scene, Sergeant Fred Nugent and Edward Angel, were that someone had been forced onto the hood or bonnet of the vehicle before it hit the gates. Doris had then braked, and he had rolled off onto the ground, whereupon she had accelerated forward, crashing through a fence and hit the tree. Nugent's notes also indicated that the tire marks indicated tremendous acceleration in the drive. Radici was, again, either mistaken or lying. The case was closed, but to his credit, State Attorney J. Joseph Nugent declared himself dissatisfied, and some parts of the press began to question the haste with which the case had been closed. As a result of this, Radici backpedaled, declaring that the investigation remained open. A second statement was drawn up by police and Doris Duke's attorneys, it seems, which he duly signed, and Joseph Radici again declared the matter closed. The New York Times agreed, putting the stamp of its authority on the matter, declaring the death of Tirella definitely an accident. There was no inquest held to inquire into the matter. No one queried this either. The police had clearly not probed the matter in any appreciable depth, and had either chosen to ignore vital evidence contradicting Doris Duke's account, or conducted their inquiries in a thoroughly incompetent manner. But with an obligingly tame press, and no desire on the part of the authorities to pursue the matter, the investigation into the death of Eduardo Tirella was ended. No further inquiries were made, and the newspapers accepted the extraordinary way in which due process had been short-circuited without complaint. Tirella's family, and many people in Rhode Island, however, and especially those who knew Doris Duke and Eduardo Tirella, were not persuaded by the authorities' easy dismissal of his death, nor were their suspicions allayed when 8 days after the accident, Doris Duke donated $25,000 to restore Cliff Walk on Newport shoreline, a project she had previously been against, gave $10,000 to Newport Hospital, and made a number of other significant bequests. Tongues were also bound to wag when 7 months afterwards, Police Chief Joseph Radici retired to Florida, where he purchased 2 condominiums, and the detective who had dealt with the accident received spectacular promotion, becoming the chief of police. None of this was a good look for the cause of justice in Rhode Island, and there was a common and widespread belief that Doris Duke had bought off her investigators and paid off the city. But whatever the suspicions of the people of Rhode Island, the matter was closed, and for a time at least, more or less uniform biographies relegated the matter of the death of Eduardo Tirella to the briefest of references, a few paragraphs at best. Eduardo Tirella had become a footnote in the glittering life of Doris Duke, with no shortage of biographers queuing up to extol her extraordinary gifts and talents. In recent years, a less flattering view of the billionairess has emerged, and writers have challenged both the virtues assigned to Doris Duke and her version of events leading to the death of Eduardo Tirella. Most notably, Peter Lance, the investigative journalist and writer, who in 2020 conducted the most detailed and exhaustive examination of the circumstances of Tirella's death in his book, Homicide at Rough Point. There are many problems evident in Doris's account concerning the events of the accident. In a statement for the insurance accident report, she stated, "I was sitting in the passenger seat. He got out to open the gate, which was locked. I moved over to the driver's seat. I put my left foot on the brake and moved the gear shift lever from park to drive. The car immediately moved forward through the gates and across Bellevue Avenue, where it struck a fence and stopped. I was injured and dazed. I looked around for Mr. Tirella. I did not see him. I went back into the house to see if he was there. A man and a woman helped me." The statement is at odds with her own statement to police and with the evidence of others whose accounts were not publicly heard because there was no inquest, and it raises many more questions than it answers. To begin with, Doris claimed she was sitting in the passenger seat and shifted into the driver's seat to drive the car through the gates while Tirella opened and closed them. But Howard McFarlane, Doris's caretaker, told police in a statement made on the 10th of October that Miss Duke's practice was for the person driving to the gates to get out of the car and open them, return to the car, drive the car out of the gates, returning once again to close the gates, and then to the car to drive away. He told police that Doris Duke had never, to his knowledge, driven the vehicle through the gates when the person driving her had opened them. Doris Duke claimed she had looked around for Mr. Tirella, but in her first statement she said she had pinned him against the gates. Which was it? Patrolman Edward Angel said in his report that he had informed Miss Duke that he is under the car, in some shock himself at this realization, and then tried to ascertain whether he was still alive. Furthermore, Judith Tom, who arrived at the scene moments after the event and who followed Doris to the house, said that Doris said, "I have run over Ed." In spite of these serious discrepancies in her statement against those of others, and even an earlier one made, police chose to ignore them. There is a great deal to suggest that the death of Eduardo Tirella did not occur in the manner in which Doris Duke claimed it did. It was known by police and the authorities at the time, as it is known today, that her account was false. In fact, the motive, means, and opportunity were in plain sight at the time Eduardo's death occurred. 1. Eduardo Tirella had gone to Rough Point specifically to inform Doris Duke that he would no longer be working for her. It is also known that he had been advised that she would receive this news badly. 2. A furious row was heard by staff on the afternoon immediately prior to his death. Although the substance of this is not known, it is beyond any real doubt that it concerned his leaving her. There was no other issue on which they are known to have argued, or it was feasible they might have quarrelled. 3. As previously mentioned, although Doris Duke claimed she had slid across into the driver's seat when Tirella went to open the gates, Howard McFarlane made a statement directly contradicting this, saying she had never done so to his knowledge. This suggests Doris Duke deliberately and purposely did so on this occasion alone. Doris was now in possession of the motive, the means, and the opportunity to commit murder, the trinity of circumstances from which murder almost always arises. 4. When Tirella got out of the station wagon and walked to the gates, Doris was required to take no less than 4 deliberate actions in order to crash into and through the gates. After moving from the passenger seat to the driver's seat, she had to release the parking brake, which was a hand control positioned on the left side of the dashboard. She had to move the automatic shift gear from park to drive, and then she had to fully or almost fully depress the gas pedal. It was essential to take each of these actions and to take them quickly and decisively for the Dodge to smash through the gates at great speed while Tirella was in front of them. If she was slow to move into the driver's seat and engage the controls as she did, then Tirella would have already opened the gates, which the damage to the gates informs us he did not. If she did not purposely release the parking brake, and she informed the insurance company that she did, then the car would not have moved forward at speed and crashed through the gates. If she did not move the car from park to drive, then the car would have remained stationary, whatever else she did. And even if all of these purposeful actions had been taken, and the gas pedal had not been fully or almost fully depressed, then the car would not have moved from rest. Even a modest application of the gas pedal would only have caused a slow drift of the car. It would not be sufficient to smash through the gates, and it would not have killed Eduardo Tirella. 5. There is another powerful indicator that the car was started violently. 2-inch deep gouge marks from the rear tires of the Dodge, some 30 feet from the gate, indicate that a racing start occurred in the driveway, i.e., someone slammed the gas pedal to the floor to cause a maximum acceleration start. The gates being still closed at the time they were hit, which we know they were because of the damage they sustained, confirms that this acceleration occurred as soon as Tirella had left the car, but before he could open the gate. It can have taken no more than seconds for him to reach the gates, yet Doris was able to fulfill the 4 deliberate conditions necessary for the car to smash into the gates, and she was able to do this very quickly. 6. It is also quite apparent, as it was to the medical examiner and to the police, that Eduardo Tirella was not pinned to the gates as Doris claimed in her account, because his legs were not injured. All his injuries were to his head and torso, his spine and lungs and brain. He was not, therefore, hit while standing up at all. He was lying down and dragged under the car. The gates being free of blood confirms that Tirella was not seriously injured here. 7. Tirella was run over in the middle of Bellevue Avenue, outside of the gates. The patrolman Angel, who attended the scene within minutes of the incident, made drawings and took notes of what he discovered. He reported that the impact took place in the middle of the avenue itself, not in the driveway or at the gates. And to be certain of this, the following morning he returned with Fred Nugent to examine the scene, and both concurred that the fatal point of impact with Tirella occurred in the middle of the avenue, some 30 feet from the gates, and that he was dragged a further 40 feet across the road to the point where the car hit the tree. Sergeant Nugent concluded that Tirella had been forced onto the bonnet of the car, had been deposited in the avenue when the car had stopped, and had then been run over. Nugent's theory was the only feasible explanation for Tirella's injuries, for the condition of the gates and for the blood and gore at the place in the road where the impact had occurred. The gate had been crashed into, but Tirella had not been caught against the gates. He had jumped up or rolled up onto the bonnet, seeing the car accelerating towards him. There is no possibility that he was pinned against the gates because of the lack of blood on the gates and the lack of injuries to Tirella's legs. He was on the bonnet as the car crashed through the gates, and as it did so, it stopped, either because of the impact against the gates and the foot being taken off the accelerator, or because the driver had braked, at which point Tirella was thrown forward from the bonnet and landed on the ground. There is no doubt that the car must have stopped or significantly slowed at this point, or Tirella would not have been thrown forward off the bonnet. Tirella would now have been lying on the road precisely at the place where the two officers identified the impact point. 8. And finally, the driver then accelerated a second time, running over Tirella as he lay on the floor, and dragging him beneath the car until it hit a tree. This entire process seems to require a second deliberate act on the part of the driver, to depress the gas pedal a second time, which caused the injuries and death of Tirella. It is quite inconceivable that this sequence of events could be accidental. It must be equally apparent that the police who were in possession of these facts knew that actions taken by Doris Duke were deliberate and occurred in such a manner that it was impossible they could have been accidental. It is thus beyond a reasonable doubt that the richest woman in America murdered Eduardo Tirella. No one but Doris Duke knew exactly what happened that afternoon at Rough Point in Rhode Island, but there is evidence enough to make an informed guess. Doris Duke was a mean woman. She was born the only daughter of a wealthy and ruthless businessman, who left her a fortune at the age of 13. It was said he had instructed her to trust no one. Whether he did or not, she certainly lived by this precept. She was generous, made presents of lavish gifts to those she favoured, to her lovers, friends and husbands, to her confidants. But she didn't trust any of them. She was constitutionally paranoid. She hired ex-FBI agents to trail friends and lovers, to keep an eye on them, where they went, who they were seeing. They would ultimately tire of her and her mean-spirited behaviour, but especially her volatility, her temper, the violence that often accompanied it, especially when she was drunk, which we know she often was. Her trust-no-one philosophy was a self-affirming principle, because it undermined the most important aspect of all relationships, trust. Thus the inevitable collapse of her relationships due to the absence of trust confirmed the truth of the principle. She had the arrogance of the quasi-despot, which sometimes afflicts the seriously wealthy and powerful. She sued her mother when she was 14 years old. She was a vexatious litigant all her life, prepared to spend large sums of money to ruin those who had offended or annoyed her. She would spend a fortune in litigation rather than give an unwilling penny. She was a lawyer's dream. Eduardo Tirella had been more than an employee to Doris Duke. He had been the means by which her genius for art, gardens, and horticultural interests might be extolled by the fashionable and the public arbiters of taste. She paid him well, and he had living quarters in all 5 of her palatial estates. She was buying the good opinion of others. She never credited him with her creations. It was said she bought nothing without consulting Eduardo. This was because he had something she had not, taste. And Eduardo was her confidant also, in that way that volatile, insecure women sometimes value the closeness of male friends who happen to be homosexual. He had supported her through her rocky relationships in the 7 years of their acquaintance, no doubt charmed and praised her beyond her deserts, because she was a woman who needed her ego to be caressed. But Eduardo had greater ambitions for himself than to be the unsung assistant, basking in the light of her reflected glory. He had genuine gifts for artistic design. He had spent that summer in the company of stars, working as a set designer in Hollywood, mingling with the beautiful and famous. He liked it. His work was appreciated, and he rubbed shoulders with another kind of American royalty, Hollywood royalty. He liked California, too, its sunlight and warmth, the greater social ease with which a gay man like himself could live in the 1960s. And his lover, Edmund Cara, lived there. The two held parties for a different sort of people. He was tired of the imperious and mercurial Doris Duke. When Eduardo Tirella talked of his plans to Edmund Cara, he was warned that they would not be well received by Doris. She would regard his leaving as nothing less than a betrayal. She was an intensely jealous woman in love and war, and everything in between. Eduardo had made up his mind. He had talent, and he understood art, while she had the money to purchase it. That is never a satisfactory division for a person of talent. Hollywood beckoned. He had come to a decision. She knew nothing about it. Eduardo chose the 6th of October 1966, on which to inform his employer that he would be leaving her entourage. He flew to Rhode Island, and Doris picked him up at the airport, and they drove to Rough Point. He knew Doris, and he knew she would react badly, but probably overestimated his ability to disarm her. Presumably he had rehearsed his approach to her. Yet he cannot have expected the vehemence of her reaction to his news. He told her almost certainly on the afternoon of the 7th of October, and he quickly realized he had a problem. Doris Duke was not a woman who could be dismissed or passed over. She did the dismissing, not the reverse. If a relationship of a formal or personal kind was over, it was when she said it was, not at someone else's whim. That is the nature of royalty. It has the authority of gods, because it is based on the same social model. Eduardo enjoyed the favour of Doris Duke, and his rejection of it was a personal insult, an affront. She got nasty because that was her nature. This side of her had probably never been directed at him before. He did not understand it, and he was not prepared to deal with it. They had words. Her words would be necessarily harsh ones. Doris must disparage him and his worth, to herself or to anyone else, because it was only thus she could assert her own superiority. But Eduardo did not fall in with the role of chastened servant. He was not her equal in possessions and wealth and power, obviously, but he understood he was her better in other creative ways. He argued back. Insults begot insults. Raised voices were heard in the house. Doris Duke was not accustomed to being challenged, and when she was, she reacted violently. She had stabbed her lover, the jazz pianist Joe Castro, on one occasion in the arm, apparently a serious wound because he sued her over the matter, and she regarded Eduardo as a mere servant, probably sought to remind him that this was his position in her employment. He regarded her as a woman with more money than sense, a woman who could not possibly comprehend or appreciate the beautiful objects she had the fortune to purchase. He may have told her so. It would be surprising if he didn't. We are candid when we are angry. He would have done better to mollify such a fragile, imperious ego, but he didn't, because he had had enough of her. Whatever insults were traded, even if they cancelled each other out, Doris would be angry, because equality of words traded between unequal people always favours the lesser person. They have stood their ground, while the superior person has lost it. Doris Duke was seething with rage as the pair went out to the car. Their row was not done, certainly not on her part. She may have been drunk, she frequently was, and it was on such occasions her violent nature revealed itself. There was probably at this point no plan formed in her mind, beyond attempts to use her money and influence to trash Eduardo's ambitions, perhaps to sue for some transgression, real or spurious, to ruin him in any case. The atmosphere as they drove down the drive was mutually abrupt, brooding, hostile. There had been transgression which had not been atoned for. Eduardo Tirella was quiet when he got out of the car to open the gates. She saw in this an ill grace towards herself. It infuriated her further, the ingratitude. She sensed a silent insult. He walked unsuspecting to the gate, satisfied to a degree that he had said his piece. He would soon be done with this woman. He addressed the key to the lock, but had no opportunity of going further, certainly not of opening the gates, when he heard the sound of the engine revving behind him, and the sound of gravel spinning out from the furious tires. He will have stopped, turned in fright and alarm to see Doris, hatred in her eyes, behind the wheel, and in terror he saw the station wagon leap towards him, with no possibility of avoiding its path. He acted as anyone would do in such a circumstance. By instinct he leapt up and rolled up the bonnet as it reached the gates. It crashed into them, bending the heavy, dull iron so that they were torn from their hinges, and then burst through them into the avenue beyond. Here the car stopped, either from impact or because Doris Duke braked hard, or possibly both, with the result that Eduardo was now flung forward beyond the front of the car, and landed on the road in front of it. He may have fractured his hip here, may have been hurt, but he was probably not seriously injured. Doris Duke, now stationary behind the wheel, saw Eduardo lying on the floor, presumably scrambling to get up like a frightened rabbit, glancing vehicle-wards in terror. She was thwarted, disgusted by him even, and in her fury and malice she put her foot to the floor and ran over him, dragging him beneath the dodge all the way across the road and through the fence to the tree where the car reached its terminal point, and her fury was spent. She sat there stunned. The horror of what had occurred would come to her as swiftly as the moment of her anger had risen, like a dark, uncontrollable fury. There was absolute silence. The car had stalled. She could hear nothing but the blood singing in her ears. She sat there for moments as the world caught up with her. A flashing light and a siren appeared very quickly behind her. A man and his daughter ran over. The patrolman was himself shocked. "He's beneath the car," he said. She wailed. She got out of the car, walked up and down, and ran to the house, the man and his daughter following. Soon attorneys and doctors and policemen and reporters were swarming about the place. Doris Duke was on her way to Newport Hospital. So was Eduardo Tirella. She was taken to a private room, cocooned in silence from the world, bristling with lawyers, immediately taking the state medical examiner onto her payroll and having him act as her proxy with the press. In any other circumstance, seeking to employ the state medical examiner as a personal physician would be considered bribery. But the police were held at bay. The governor, senators were informed. People in high places were summoned, mobilized. Editors and police chiefs were soon in her pocket. It was impossible to touch Doris Duke. Eduardo Tirella lay in the hospital morgue. In Doris Duke there were all the makings of a female Citizen Kane, the seeds of greatness and those of her destruction. She was not without talent in a variety of spheres, but never stayed the course long enough in anything to make it count, and in every aspect of her life From her myriad careers to her endless romances, she was a gadfly. After the dust settled, the Tirella family tried to sue Doris Duke in the civil courts for damages. She fought them tooth and nail, and her attorneys were merciless in their denigration of Tirella. The sum the family sought was relatively modest for their loss, $200,000. After 5 years' battle, they got $75,000. That's approximately $500,000 in 2024. And after legal expenses, this was whittled down to a mere $5,000 for each sibling. It was pocket money to Doris Duke. Tirella's mother did not recover from the shock of her favourite son's death. She died just 6 weeks later. Sometimes death comes as a blessed relief. Doris Duke's philanthropic work continued. In it she sought to buy the public's goodwill, its good opinion, and to carve an epitaph worthy of the woman she wished to be remembered as. She was not a person who could love, and probably never inspired it in any great measure in anyone else either. She remained a divisive figure, too. She raised bail for Imelda Marcos following her arrest in the Philippines for racketeering in the 1980s. In 1992 she had a facelift. She was 79 years old now and had a fall soon afterwards, breaking her hip. Her health declined, and she had further surgery for knee replacements in January and July of 1993. She became progressively ill and bedridden, dependent on those about her whom she despised, and she died from a stroke on the 28th of October 1993, at the age of 80. Her will was contested, her life ending as it had been lived, in litigation. There is one final footnote to the matter of the death of Eduardo Tirella. Doris Duke subsequently became romantically involved with an ex-World War II RAF pilot called Peter Byrne. He told the writer Peter Lance that she once spoke of Eduardo Tirella to him. Her exact words to him were, he said, "He got what he deserved. Nobody 2 times me." It is impossible to tell at this distance whether Doris Duke said this or not. Third-party confessions are a commonplace in these cases, and are seldom of any value. But at least in this instance, it has the virtue of being entirely in accord with Doris's character.